Hello and welcome to another IoT Central webinar. I'm David O'Hara and I'm the Managing Director at IoT Central. I'd like to start by thanking Ground Control for sponsoring today's event. Today's webinar is number 6 in a 6-part series and it's titled Choosing the Right Satellite IoT Network for Your Remote Application. Now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Alistair McLeod is the CEO at Ground Control, and joining Alistair is Oliver Potter, the COO at Ground Control. Gentlemen, when you're ready, let's get started.
All right, well, thanks, David, and it's great to be back again at IoT Central. Thanks for having us. Hopefully an interesting topic for your members this afternoon, choosing the right satellite IoT network for your remote application. I'm going to be presenting Alistair. I'm the CEO of Ground Control, and my colleague Ollie, the COO, will walk you through some thoughts on this topic. This is how we plan to break it down this afternoon, what we'll cover. So why satellite in the first place? It's probably an obvious place to start. There's a lot to know about satellite IoT. There's sort of more dimensions to it, I think, than classic IoT. So we'll walk you through some of the basics around the networks. In particular, Ollie will walk you through a lot of the considerations around choosing the different networks and why would you choose one versus the other and so on. We'll wrap up with some case studies. Hopefully that's a good agenda. All right, so as I said at the start, why satellite in the first place? It's a fair question. I mean, satellite tends to be used when there's an absolutely critical application, or when there's a need for a backup, or when the application is in a place where there isn't really a ready alternative. There's no access to a terrestrial network, for example. So you can see there on the slide, but yeah, benefits or reasons to deploy satellite. Firstly is coverage. One way or the other, you can do satellite IoT anywhere on the planet, literally anywhere on the planet. These tend to be high availability networks. I mean, whether you're talking about a geo, where the satellites are put up into a static orbit and they're probably up there for 20 to 30 years, they're just hyper reliable pieces of technology. Whether you're talking about a more modern LEO network, where there are hundreds or thousands of satellites sort of circling the Earth all the time, you've got a high reliability network that's built to be there all the time, and it's really kind of purpose-built technology for mission critical applications like IoT. Sometimes satellites used for resilience. We have customers that use satellite IoT as a backup to terrestrial IoT over a landline, or backup to terrestrial IoT over cellular, and it can be good for that as well. Increasingly, there's a lot of interest around privacy, security concerns, and so on. You can do some things with satellite IoT that are harder to construct with a terrestrial-based network. For example, we have some customers that have built a whole hub-and-spoke IoT network that never even touches the public internet. But even if you don't go to that extreme, you can stay further away from the internet. You can avoid things like man-in-the-middle intercepts and so on. There's a lot of clever things you can do to make your network more secure. And usually there's no roaming needed. I mean, that may change in the future with standards-based IoT, but with the classic satellite IoT we're mostly going to talk about today, you're not roaming. You're on a proprietary network end-to-end. So you have that stability, that constancy. You don't have, for example, some of the challenges you sometimes experience when you develop a narrowband IoT application for one network and then you move it to another, it doesn't quite work, or you roam to another network and the performance isn't what you expected. So there's a whole bunch of really compelling benefits for using this, but the biggest underlying reason is because it's the solution that's available for something that's critical and has to be connected, and satellite gives you that ubiquity. There are some considerations to think about when deploying this stuff. Again, there's a lot to satellite IoT. That's where an expert partner like Ground Control comes in. You need to think about speed. Classically, with terrestrial IoT, the most common form is you either use Wi-Fi or you plug in an Ethernet cable and off you go with a super fast connection. Satellite IoT, we tend to think a lot more about what needs to be in the payload. Let's not send more data than we need to, and we want to think about how fast it needs to be, and there's a bunch of other sort of speed and payload related issues we'll come to later. You do think more about costs. Space is a long way away. It tends to be more expensive per byte to send data over a satellite than over a terrestrial network. So we work hard to help people optimize what they're paying, and a big part of that is what you're sending. There's a required, kind of obvious, but not everybody thinks of it. There has to be a clear view of the sky, and that can be super limiting in some cases and not limiting at all in others. There's usually a solution. Some networks are more prone to issues with line of sight, which Ollie will cover in a moment actually. But nonetheless, indoor doesn't work. And if you are in built-up areas or forested areas or mountainous areas, then some thought needs to go into the right solution. Antenna installation can be a thing. I mean, it has to have a clear view of the sky regardless, but some networks, the installation of the antenna can be a specialist topic. Other times it's, put it on the top of a pole, and as long as it can see the sky, you're fine. And then lastly, at least for today, considerations, some satellite technologies can be susceptible to weather interference, others are not. Again, that's something we can give guidance on. Most of the IoT networks that we sell aren't susceptible to weather, but it's a thing to think about, particularly at the cheaper end of the range of solutions. Just a little quick primer on some of the absolute sort of basic terms that everybody's heard about now, because thanks to Elon Musk, this is in the press all the time. LEO, MEO, GEO, these are the sort of three labels for the categories of network, and they refer to how high the satellite is in the sky, in case that isn't obvious. So Starlink and Iridium and many others, these are low Earth orbit networks. It means that the satellite is pretty close to the Earth. Many benefits of that, obviously lower latency because the signal doesn't have to travel so far. But it also comes with a tax in terms of either how often does the satellite pass overhead, or how many satellites do you need to use to give coverage. But this is the most common network used for IoT, I would say. I'll go straight to the other extreme, geostationary. This is really where it all started with satellite comms. These are really high in the sky, 35,000 kilometers above the Earth. They don't move relative to the sky, or at least they move a very small amount. More specialist installation, but if you're in the right place in the world, and the satellite's located appropriately relative to where you are, it can be an absolutely great solution. And again, we have many customers using that. And then, to state the obvious, but MEO is the one in the middle. It's sort of height-wise, it's halfway between the two. It's used by the navigation system, GPS, or more generally GNSS. But again, we'll see more constellations in that space. And without getting into the sort of super geeky stuff like the frequencies and so on, this is broadly how it breaks down. The middle one, L-band, it's fair to say that's what we sell most for IoT, because it doesn't carry loads of bandwidth, but it's super reliable, it's super low latency, and it's unaffected by weather. So it's really perfect for a lot of IoT applications. Small antenna, small power footprint, and so on. And then above it, you've got KA and KU. Most commonly, you'll have seen these in what are called VSAT installations, so smallish satellite dishes, if you want. KA band, slightly more weather prone than KU, but essentially it's the same sort of technology, and these are talking to geo networks. And then at the other end of the spectrum, UHF and VHF, very low bandwidth indeed, but sort of super reliable for line of sight communications. So all right, look, those are a few of the basics, and I'm going to hand you over to Ollie to sort of take you through the next steps.
Thanks, Alistair. So now you understand all about LEO, GEOs and frequencies. Really, where do we start our conversation? So all of our customers are often managing two budgets that this bit that it is determined by. So they're managing a cost budget. So as Alistair already said, it's probably a bit more expensive than your cellular connection, so you need to try and minimize cost. And secondly, you're trying to manage a power budget. You're probably in a more remote area. You might be reliant on solar or a long-term battery, and you might need to manage that. Or equally, you might not. You might have power there. So one of the first things we talk about is what's the information that the customer is trying to transmit. What do they need to get from A to B? And I use the word information rather than data to try and really understand, is it sort of a change in a temperature, or is it a kind of a video stream? Really quite different levels of information that might need to come across. And the way the networks break that down is we have two kind of key services. You can offer up a TCP/IP stream from the device to the satellite network and then back into the back-end platforms, or you can use messaging, and messaging can come in sort of real-time messaging or a sort of store and forward messaging format as well. So the kind of typical conversations are, does the application need TCP/IP? That might be you've already constructed it in a cellular world and are already using it and don't want to re-engineer it. It might mean you've got a chatty sort of platform and device that need to talk to each other in real time. And in that case, you're looking for a TCP/IP network. If you don't need all of that and you can work with messaging, then messaging has real benefits of stripping out the TCP/IP overheads that would be transmitted with TCP/IP traffic, and enables you to use, therefore, a lot less data to send that bit of information, and correspondingly use less power because you're transmitting less data. Your device is not transmitting quite so frequently. So we work with our customers to kind of choose between those two. You know, the vast majority of the volume would sit through messaging, but there are clear use cases where TCP/IP is required and needed, and there are some fantastic solutions about that. So then to talk about the networks, we'll jump to the next slide here to give you some examples of where they sit. So at the top right here, you're looking at kind of higher data rates and kind of higher power. And in here you have kind of the Starlink broadband service. You have new standards-based services that will be coming out, so sort of a Cat1 LTE service, which is what the Starlink D2C offering is looking to launch in select countries kind of through this year. Then if you move slightly less power and slightly less data rate, you're then looking at some brilliant IP services that are available. So you've got the Iridium's Certus 100, which uses their LEO constellation of satellites to deliver that service. And then you've got the Viasat IoT Pro as well. Again, that's then a geo service, but offering really good IP, TCP/IP links. If you then want to move down the data rate and down the power consumption, you then have really kind of a couple of options there. So there are some brilliant proprietary services that are already out there. So Iridium's SPD and sort of the Inmarsat or now the Viasat IDP are really brilliant messaging services available all around the globe, and then have that really efficient way of transmitting data, both from a cost perspective and from a battery life perspective. There's a little red box on the chart, which is new, not really launched yet, but sort of in testing phase, is sort of the non-terrestrial network narrowband IoT, and we see kind of exciting opportunity to be able to use that technology in order to provide messaging as well. So I think I'm going to move forward, and Alistair's going to talk about movement.
So the next question often needs to get asked is your application moving or stationary? It matters for a few different reasons. The most obvious one being that for some applications where you're using a geo satellite, a geostationary satellite, if your antenna needs to be pointing at the satellite, then obviously if it's moving, it's not impossible, but that makes it more complex. So naturally, LEO networks tend to lend themselves better to mobile applications, and geostationary networks tend to lend themselves naturally towards stationary applications. But I wish it was as simple as that. It's not. It's never quite as simple as that, because there are plenty of counter examples, and both types of network can be fantastic for all manner of applications. But just to give you some examples here, at the left-hand end, where we're looking at static sensors, water level sensors, and soil moisture sensors, provided wherever your sensors are, it can see the relevant part of the sky, then geo can be perfect, and you can get some very effective, very cost-effective solutions that run over a geo network. Those things tend to send really small amounts of data anyway, so there's plenty of options there. Drifting data buoys, honestly, we probably could have put that anywhere between where it is now and halfway across the slide, because again, it depends. Drifting data buoys are moving, so you might ask why it's sort of more down the sort of the static end, but they're not moving very fast, and also because they tend to be sending relatively small amounts of data. They can cope with an antenna system that has a bit less gain than either a flat panel or a small dish, and therefore they can be well suited to that. But again, they tend to have drifting data buoys tend to have a really good view of the sky, so using a geo is quite usually possible. I probably won't go through kind of all of the cases, but obviously you get the gist. But if I sort of go to the middle to give you an example there, heavy machinery, there are plenty of examples where sort of the classic yellow plant equipment, they use both geos and LEOs. I mean, there's one kind of global yellow plant manufacturer that we could name, who have widely deployed both Iridium type technology and Viasat type technology. They both have their place. That really is a classic case of finding experts and explain what your use case is and what parameters are important to you. We can help you decide, but because it's mobile, but it's not super mobile. It will come down to factors like, to what extent when that vehicle is in movement, how likely is it to have a view of the sky that's obscured from the part of the sky it needs to see. So always the same factors. When we get to the other end of the spectrum, the faster moving stuff, again, everything's possible. Before there were LEO networks, people made antennas work just fine on geostationary satellites, but LEOs lend themselves very well to this. As we'll see in a moment, there are a lot of satellites passing overhead, and that makes it pretty likely that you can always get to a satellite when you need one. So at this end, and this is fair to say, we do a lot of our business at this end of the spectrum, unmanned vessels, whether they are manned surface vessels or drones, UAVs, trucks, as in commercial trucks that need to be connected for logistics reasons, for cold chain management and so on, and trains very much sort of can be at the fast and high end bandwidth end of the spectrum. So just a kind of little wash up there of mobile versus stationary, but it's always a factor to take into account with satellite, mostly, as I say, because of the relative positioning of the device you're trying to transmit from to the satellite, and the nature of the antenna and the transmission path that you're planning to use. Other factor is how time critical is it, and this is something that isn't always obvious if what you've known is terrestrial IoT, where the communication is kind of real-time, open path stuff. But how time critical is it? Making the right choice here can make quite a big difference to you ending up with the right solution, and in particular the most cost-effective solution. And fundamentally, there are two factors driving how quickly you'll get your data when you use satellite IoT. What you're looking at here is the first one, which is that there is a built-in, and for those of you old enough to remember, if you used to use a transatlantic phone, before we had undersea cables, the calls went over the satellite and you could hear the delay, and that's because of the distance the signal had to travel. It's just the same today. Space is still an awful long way away, 35,000 kilometers up and 35k back. So you see there, you get a long round trip delay with the GEO, and you get a much shorter round trip delay with the LEO. As a matter of fact, if you talk over a voice link on a LEO satellite, you wouldn't notice that you were talking on a satellite. So that's if you like, it's inside that human tolerance for delay. So that's one factor that will affect it, and that in IoT terms, where does that matter? It matters if you've got an application that's very sensitive to latency. That's the most obvious one. Some applications just handle latency fine. Others, they have a window that they can cope with, and beyond that, the application just thinks that the link has failed and keeps keeps rejecting it. So that's one thing. On the other hand, this is particularly true of some of the newer messaging-based satellite networks that are up there at the moment. Again, not as obvious as you might think if you're used to having kind of ubiquitous communication or an open pipe. But to give you an example, the Iridium Iridium network has around 700 satellites. 66 satellites circling the world, which means anywhere on the Earth you can usually see 2 or 3, so you'll always be in connection. At the other end of the spectrum, there are networks that at the moment have only got 2, 3, or 4 satellites up there. They work perfectly well, but then you have to wait for the satellite to appear. And if you're using messaging and you're happy with a store and forward type application, and your data isn't time critical, that can be a really cost-effective way of doing it. So Agritech would be a perfect example of that. So long as you get your moisture readings fairly regularly, you probably don't mind if there's a bit of a delay before they come through, because nothing's going to change in the next 2 hours. So again, messaging when the satellite passes over you can be a factor, and that comes down to how many satellites there are, how often your application will see the satellite. Right, Ollie, over to you to talk about sensor location and the implications.
So let's talk about the LEO sensor. So the antenna on a LEO has to see kind of a good clear view of the sky. And you don't point them at the LEO satellite, because the LEO satellite is moving over you all of the time. And as Alison said, you might see 2, 3 at once, or if it's a store and forward network, the device itself would know what time the satellite's going to come over, wake itself up to communicate at that point in time. But the advantage of a LEO satellite antenna is you point it with a clear view of the sky, just upwards. You don't need to point it at any kind of particular location in the sky. And that's why it works so well for moving vehicles and moving assets. But equally for static assets, it means the install costs and install expertise are that much lower because you're just pointing it straight up and you don't need to worry about where it's pointed. If you're behind a tree or behind a building, you might have an obscure view of the sky. And the implication of that might be that you have sections of the day or sections of the minute where it can't see a satellite, but you would always get a part of the time when it would see that. And I guess depending on how critical your application is, would depend on how critical it is to have a kind of sort of 360 view, not 360, 180 view of the sky. And we're going to jump onto geo. So geo now, as Alistair said, it's geostationary, so it's staying in this particular bit above the Earth. And that means your device has to see that actual satellite. Now, there are now sort of phased array, clever antennas that will sort of electronically steer the beam to a kind of particular location. They do work, but they are quite expensive. But traditionally, you've got to get your device and that antenna pointed at that bit of the sky. So if there's a particular tree in the way, or a hill in the way, or a valley in the way, that might be a problem, which means you just can't use geo. But for a fixed application, unlike LEO, the satellite is not moving. So once you've got a connection and you are attached to that satellite, it's not going to stop. So there are clearly sort of slight trade-offs there, depending on what device it is that you're attaching it to, and kind of how critical and how constantly connected it would need to be. So advantages for LEO and advantages for geo, and that's why we have a big conversation. So I guess to put all of that together into a bit of a sort of decision tree, and while there's a lot on this slide, try to keep it fairly high level. So what information are you passing? Are you using, do you need IP, or can you be more efficient with your data cost and your battery life by moving to messaging? So kind of decision one. Decision two then on here is, there is now an emerging choice between sort of proprietary networks, which are brilliant, but also some standards-based networks, which are new, but could be really compelling in the coming years ahead. And really the proprietary networks, reliable, trusted, kind of custom designed for satellite. But the advantages of a standards-based network is you might be able to use a sort of more off-the-shelf module down the line when they're available that would then be able to communicate with it, which might mean you have a sort of more consistent experience with your sort of cellular side and your satellite side. But then into the proprietary side, you're then, or into both of these sides, you're then looking at, well, what are the geo networks or LEO networks? Is my device moving or not? And that's both on the IP and the messaging side. And then within that, then, and this is where I can't simplify it totally, you've got to come talk to someone like ground control to really help you understand, well, what is the actual message size you need to send, or how fast does the data stream need to be, therefore what network options have you got available. There are cost considerations between the different networks to kind of plug it all together. So you can see how the questions that Alistair and I have just taken you through then lead ultimately to a recommendation of a particular network for your use case. Should we talk about some use cases at the end? Yeah.
So I've chosen 3 here. These are real examples that we've delivered, among many, obviously, and I've removed the names to protect the innocent, but you'll absolutely get the gist. I'm going to work actually from right to left on this slide, just so to kind of end with the kind of the more kind of glamorous solution side. So soil moisture sensor as a start point. So we sort of touched on Agritech a couple of times, right? But it's stationary. That was one of our considerations. It's remote. Because it's remote, not only will it not have any other form of comms readily available to it, it doesn't have any power readily available to it. So that means we need a device that doesn't consume much power. To give you a sense of it, a Starlink terminal, which is a fantastic device, by the way, but it'll consume between 25 and 50 watts of electrical power, and that's an awful lot if you have to power it off a solar panel. Whereas a Viasat device or an Inmarsat or an Iridium device that's built for IoT will probably consume a few microwatts when it's not busy and a few milliwatts when it is. So power is a good thing. Very low data volume, so it lends itself very well to a message-based solution. You heard me refer to it earlier as the payload. So we're basically packaging up the data from the sensor on a periodic basis and then transmitting it as a bundle of numbers, but pretty small bundle. It's only needed once a day. So in this case, the data is only needed once a day. So we would for this solution, we'd provide a solution like Iridium short burst data, which is a messaging-based service, or Viasat IoT Nano, or for any of you who've heard of it before, it used to be called Inmarsat Data Pro, IDP, or a new service coming from Viasat called IoT Direct. So a whole bunch of options there for sending small amounts of data on a sort of a not particularly frequent basis, but in a low cost, small form factor, low power, sort of super simple application. In the middle there, we're sort of working our way up towards, as I said, towards the kind of the glamour end in terms of what we consider to be high-end satellite IoT. Here we're dealing with a weather station. Some of the same considerations. It's stationary. Okay, great. In a mountainous area, it still needs to be powered by solar, but now we're talking about needing more data, and we're needing the data also needs to be more timely, like the latency between when the sensor takes a reading and when the reading arrives at the other end is a shorter period of time, and therefore we can't consider a network where the data might be 1 or 2 hours latent. I mean, as a live example, when we record this podcast, you only have to look at the main international news today to see what's happening in Los Angeles to understand how important it is for us to get better at detecting changes in climate or changes in the weather and acting preemptively. And this sort of application, including our customer that's doing this, that's exactly what this sort of thing can be used for. They're going to put weather stations all over the place, and they're going to use the data from those weather stations plus some AI to detect anomalies and trends and then take some preemptive action. With satellite IoT here, again, we're talking about potentially using, again, Viasat IoT Nano or Iridium IMT. And Iridium IMT is a larger payload message-based solution from Iridium, whereas short burst data can take around 300 bytes each time it sends a message. Iridium IMT can send up to 100 kilobytes each time it sends a message, and it sends it slightly faster. So it's kind of like a middle level solution for IoT over satellite, still messaging based. And then at the left-hand side, our TCP/IP solutions tend to run at much slower speeds than classic cellular IoT solutions because of as I said, the complexity and cost of getting the data to space and back. So this is kind of at the upper end of satellite IoT as we sit here today, anyway, for sending IoT over TCP/IP link. This is the picture there is a USV, an unmanned surface vessel or a floating drone, if you want to look at it that way. We have quite a lot of customers doing this now. And now this is, we think about one of the considerations here, it's fully mobile. And it's likely to be sort of unpredictable in terms of its orientation at any given time. So ideally, it needs to operate with an omnidirectional antenna and a clear view of the sky so that it doesn't matter. It can always communicate regardless of whether it's pitching or yawing or wherever the satellite happens to be at the time. And that very much suits a LEO network. Open ocean, so no problem seeing the satellite, and for the most of the time this thing will have a 180 by 180 hemispherical view of the complete sky, which is perfect. In this case, though, the IoT connection is being used for what drone guys call beyond visual line of sight. So we're actually operating the drone or operating the USV using that IoT link, but it can work anywhere in the world. So it literally is a global solution. But again, still low powered, relatively low powered. I mean, more so than the others, but here we're talking about between 1 and 5 watts. And possibly peaking as high as 8 or 9 watts if it's really hammering the network with a lot of traffic. But it's very much in the realm of small enough in form factor, light enough, low enough power that it can still be put onto a pretty small device. And some of these USVs are quite big, some of them are really quite tiny. But here we're talking about critical real-time data because the monitoring task may or may not have critical real-time needs, but the need to control it usually will have. And so whether it's sort of sending back a video feed or sending back images or sending back sort of detailed ocean readings from a sensor hanging underneath it, There's a lot of data being sent back and forth to control it and to do the sort of sensing monitoring thing. And so there it's much more suited to a TCP/IP connection. And in this case, we use Iridium Certus 100, which is their narrowband or their sort of narrowband TCP/IP offering, but again, based on a LEO network. So there's 3 case studies among honestly hundreds we could have given you, but I hope those were 3 interesting ones. So look, just to wrap up for now, I mean, it was really hard to know how to sort of cover what can be a relatively complex and sort of mind-boggling topic in sort of 25, 30 minutes. But we've tried to hit on the main themes. But I mean, if there's something to take out of this, I'd say if you're considering, deploying IoT over satellite, it's definitely worth finding a good partner to talk to. There are far fewer solutions in satellite IoT that are buy a box off the shelf, plug it in, off you go, and many more where, to get the best out of it and to get the best ROI for your solution, you want to talk to people who can help you optimize not just the technical solution, but also the economics. We're one of those companies and we'd love to talk to you. This is just quick sort of 60-second resume of ground control. We've been at this a very long time, more than 20 years. In fact, we have some customers that are heading for 30 years now. We are set up to provide solutions on whichever network is the best for the application. So although we think some networks lend themselves better to IoT than others, so we tend to prefer those, we're only choosing networks on the basis of what's best for the customer or what's best for the partner. We're a big player, so we have great airtime rates. We're very competitive, particularly on the big IoT networks. We are extremely active in some of the newer things. Like at the moment, if you're an IoT, you can't pick up a magazine or a flyer without seeing some reference to standards-based IoT or the convergence of satellites and cellular IoT, 3GPP standards and so on. And we're very much in the vanguard of that, working with all the satellite networks who are looking at it, but also talking to the cellular networks, and all of our platforms and all our tech is all set up to handle it. So as those networks start to come on stream, we'll be a good partner to work with on that. We have our own platform, so everything from managing the remote device, which we're able to do, all the way through to the usual stuff, subscription management and billing, and then onwards to helping you manage complex data flows, helping you configure IP networks, and actually we're just now stretching out into helping you put all of that on a dashboard, so that your users have got a friendly interface to monitor and control. We do all of those things, and a lot of the hardware we also design and build ourselves, which probably sounds a little strange coming from a cellular IoT world, but the reason we do that is because there's so much juice to be had in optimizing the solution to exactly meet what the customer wants. And we have found that to get the best out of IoT over satellite, you really need to have something that's built for purpose. And we felt like there wasn't enough good stuff out there that was built for purpose, so we started building it ourselves. So no, that's ground control. I hope that was a helpful run through on choosing the right network for your satellite IoT application. We'd love to talk to you. You know where we are now. Thanks for listening, and I'm going to hand you back to David.
This brings our webinar to a close. I'd like to thank Alistair and Oliver for their insights, and especially thank Ground Control for sponsoring today's event. You can see more webinars at iotcentral.io. Thanks for watching.